One of my all-time favorite things to do when I was little was to go on trips to the seaside with my grandma. She'd sit down on the sand with all the other grandmas, armed with her cooler full of drinks and food, and I'd go splashing in the water with my brother, sister, and all the other kids. Building sandcastles right by the edge of the water was the best. After building a castle, we'd dig out the biggest moat to try and stop the castle from crumbling as the waves edged closer and closer. Whilst waiting for the tide to come in, I'd go from rock pool to rock pool, meticulously investigating, like a private detective, what treasures lay under the curtains of seaweed. Fast-moving crabs were always a big hit. But after a while, I began noticing other creatures. What first appeared to be a small white rock was in fact a slow-moving limpet. I'd peer in closer at the underwater garden, using a stick to gently swirl the water. All of a sudden, a coral-coloured starfish would begin to limber up. Sea anemones would move their tentacles back and forth like stringy jelly sweets that had come to life, wafting food towards their open mouths. I'd spend hours searching for the perfect conch shell and try in vain to nudge barnacles off the rocks. I even considered collecting some mussels for dinner, although in the end I left them right where they were. Firstly, because I knew my grandma wouldn't have been best pleased with me carrying a soaking bag of smelly mussels on the coach ride home. And secondly, just like Kaichang Li, whose story we're about to hear, I too had trouble prizing them off the rocks they were attached to. Little did Kaichang Li know, as he searched for crabs with a friend along the rocky beach at Newport on the Oregon coast in the United States of America, that this day was going to change his life. Despite their searching, the two friends didn't have any luck finding crabs. But as he was wading in the surf, Kaichang Li spotted the exciting new glue of the future. Beneath the surface of the water, a group of blue mussels were anchored to the slippery rocks, clinging tight against the turbulent waves. Hello and welcome to 30 Animals That Made Us Smarter from the BBC World Service, the series in which we hear the extraordinary ways in which animals have inspired solutions to human challenges. I'm Patrick Ihe and I really hope you're enjoying the series. Do let us know by leaving ratings and reviews where you can. And the hashtag on social media is 30 Animals. Do tell your friends and your family about the series. So let's head back to the coast, because in this, number 8, Mussels and Plywood, we'll hear how a seafood favourite inspired a new powerful glue and a better kind of plywood. Having failed to find any crabs and determined not to leave the beach empty-handed, the two friends sat down amongst the rocks and instead tried to collect some mussels. Lee, who is a chemist at Oregon State University, was amazed at how much strength and effort was needed to pull the shellfish off the rocks. In fact, the men failed to pull any of the mussels off the rocks by hand and had to use a large piece of driftwood to prise some of them free. Whilst his friend took a share of the mussels home to eat, Lee took his portion back to the lab, eager to find out how these creatures achieved their remarkable grip. The blue mussel, also known as the common mussel, is a medium-sized bivalve, meaning it has a hinged double shell. It's about 10 centimeters long and 5 centimeters wide. Its shell varies in color from purple to brown to blue. They're found widely, including along the Arctic, North Atlantic and Baltic Sea coastlines. The best places to look for them are on rocky shores, where they're attached to the exposed rock and in crevices, as well as on piers in sheltered harbours and estuaries. They may all look alike, but there are different sexes of males and females. The adults reproduce by releasing sperm and eggs into the water to be fertilised. As you can imagine, this is all a bit of a hit-and-miss affair, and despite far greater numbers of sperm being released than eggs, many eggs are not fertilised. Mussels are described as being semi-sessile, This means they're able to detach and then reattach to the surface so that they can reposition themselves as and when the water levels change. Dense masses of mussels attach themselves to surfaces by what looks like a beard. This beard is made up of 50 to 100 individual threads called byssus threads, which are produced by a byssal gland inside the shell. At the end of the thread is a small adhesive plaque, and it's these which the mussels use to cling to different surfaces. The surface or cuticle of the thread is as hard as the epoxy resin or adhesive used to manufacture printed circuit boards, but it still has the ability to flex and extend. The juvenile or young mussels, which are less than 2 centimeters in length, can use their byssal threads like climbing ropes, extending, attaching, and pulling themselves forward. Matt Harrington and his research group at the Max Planck Institute of Colloids and Interfaces discovered that there are separate glands responsible for the adhesive plaque at the end of a byssal thread, for the core and for the cuticle. But what really fascinated Li when he began researching the mussels was that these threads are made of proteins. The mussels stick to the rocks through strings of proteins. Proteins are made from building blocks or ingredients called amino acids, and the composition of these amino acids was unique. For Li, this was a eureka moment. Could he use this knowledge to make a super sticky glue? A good adhesive must be strong, of course, but also flexible, and the mussels had evolved a perfect solution. But what also impressed Li was that he didn't know of any other type of adhesive that could work as well in water and withstand so much force. Now, whilst Li was thinking about his mussels, Steve Peng, who's the Vice President of Technology at Columbia Forest Products in the United States, was thinking about his hardwood plywood. Hardwood plywood is made of several thin sheets of wood that are glued together. The result is a versatile and highly workable material because this layering of thin sheets of wood gives it strength and flexibility. It's the sort of thing that's often used to make the doors and sides of cupboards as well as floors and walls. As you can probably guess, there's loads of it about in homes, schools, stores and offices. Well, Steve had a problem. He was concerned about the use of formaldehyde in products produced by the company. The reason he was concerned was because there was growing evidence of a link between formaldehyde and cancer. Steve and his colleagues were eager to find something that could replace the formaldehyde in the decorative plywood produced by the company. Back at Oregon State University, Li was having tofu for lunch one day, and it got him thinking about soybeans, as these are used to make tofu. He remembered that soy contains about 50% protein. So then he wondered excitedly if he could convert the soya protein, a renewable natural resource, into mussel protein to create an effective adhesive. He was keen to find out. He compared the chemical structures of soy protein and mussel protein and invented a glue by mixing the soy flour and a curing agent in water. A curing agent is a substance which is used to harden a material, and the curing agent that Li used was already commonly used in paper towels and tissue paper. The plywood he made was very water resistant. And to demonstrate this, he boiled samples of plywood and then dried them in the oven, and they didn't fall apart. As many of you will know, wood swells when it gets wet and shrinks when it gets dry. This swelling and shrinking created a lot of pressure on the glue when the plywood was boiled and dried. And yet the new glue remained water resistant, just as the mussels remain attached to the rocks as they're soaked and dried by the sea and the sun. As Li explains it, the adhesive penetrates the wood fiber and locks it in place. It's like you put a key in a lock and turn it. You can't get it out. When he was happy with the result, Li gave a presentation about his work. And guess who was in the audience? Steve Peng. Steve couldn't quite believe his ears. Here seemed to be the answer to his problem. An answer which he'd been looking for years. So given that there's no time like the present, Steve immediately got to talking to Li after his presentation, and before he left, they'd struck up a deal to pursue commercialization of Li's adhesive. This was in 2003. Work began in the lab, first using a portable mixing system, and then Li and his team went to the factory and tried it out. But the first trial was a disaster. Nothing worked. Now, Li might have given up there and then, but just like the mussels which had first inspired him, once he got attached to an idea, there was no letting go. And so, like any good chemist, he returned to the lab, reviewed what worked and what didn't, and tried again. And very soon, he found a solution. In 2005, Peng's company had started converting their mills, and by 2006, the company had converted all of its plywood plants away from formaldehyde-based adhesives to this new soy-based glue. In recent years, the regulations about formaldehyde use in plywood and other wood products have been tightened, and many other companies have converted to using a soy-based resin as the bonding agent. Just think, if Li had caught some crabs on that day on the beach, he might never have stumbled across those mussels and discovered their tenacious grip, or known the impact he'd have on hardwood plywood production. In the next episode of 30 Animals That Made Us Smarter, an original podcast from the BBC World Service, we'll be taking lessons from termites as we discover just how their mounds inspired an architect with a large-scale heating and ventilation problem. But before then, you can find a list of sources of information for this episode on our website, bbcworldservice.com/30animals, where you'll also find great animations to accompany this series. Watch the fireflies and the light bulbs from the previous episode, and the kingfisher and the bullet train from episode 1. And don't forget to spread the word in whatever way you can. On social media, the hashtag is 30animals. Thanks for listening.